Hello, Dr. Natalie. Welcome to the Naked Dialogue podcast. How are you doing in general?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Sanjana. It's great to be here. And we're not naked, so that's good.
Yes. Tell me more about you, what you do. Introduce yourself so people get an idea of who Dr. Nathalie Martinek is. Did I pronounce it?
Yeah, perfect. I mean, I think there's lots of pronunciations, but that one sounded fine. So I'm a former researcher. My background was in developmental cellular biology and genetics. And then I went into cancer research. And then I left that whole environment when I recognized my needs weren't being met. And I was more interested in suffering and what is the root cause of human suffering, which is what I was attempting to work out using biology and medical research, and started to go into more of the parenting research space and knowledge translation and communication. So I've kind of arrived at this place called the Narcissism hacker. And during that transitional time, I started really observing medical culture and medical professionals, as well as all the other health professionals within healthcare. And so I've sort of ended up in this as an independent medical workplace and culture researcher and medical training culture, I guess, researcher. And I've moved into mediation and relationship coaching. And right now I'm a consultant for leaders and executives in healthcare mainly, and also in related industries here in Australia and around the world. And I just help people, leaders, navigate the complexities of professional and personal relationships, helping them gain behavioral insight, develop strategic communication and relational skills, while also managing the risk to their reputation and their career progression. So it's being very strategic about what they can and should not do when they discover they're in a conflict situation or in a toxic workplace environment. And so I kind of make a link between studying toxic environments in cell culture, tissue culture, and organisms and cancer, and into how certain toxic behaviors metastasize, take over an entire culture and organization. And part of it is really understanding narcissism and what it is that makes any one of us need to maintain control and seek power. What are our drivers and motivators, and how people play that out in their different relationships, mostly unconsciously. So I help people by raising awareness about narcissistic behaviors and the early warning signs, as well as the conditions that result in narcissistic relationships and how to strategically exit them, as well as self-preservation tactics while you're trying to exit these toxic situations to prevent psychological and financial and reputation harm. And I also have self-published a book called The Little Book of Assertiveness, inspired by the things that I've learned about observing, analyzing workplace culture and the microaggressions that occur, and I created developed some scripts to help people think about how they might respond instead of being reactive and defensive, how to respond in a way that might stimulate someone else's self-awareness and refocus on the goals and what we're trying to achieve. So moving out of the emotional stuff and into more of the task and outcomes focus in the way people communicate. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, it seems like you have a huge amount of knowledge and good amount of background, in terms of narcissism, then the cancer research. It's actually really fascinating that you have such, so much work actually that you do. Talking about narcissism, how would you define narcissism?
Yeah, so there's the typical, clinical information about it. So narcissism tends to be described as a self-centered personality type or self-centered personality style, and with somebody having a great degree of self-interest in their appearance or with their own needs, and often at the expense of others. So when I describe narcissism, and it's not just me that came up, I didn't come up with this, it's seen as a spectrum of behavioral traits that any of us exhibit to attract, connect and bond and form relationships with other people. And we become narcissistic, meaning we center our needs above others, or we make others' needs more important than ourselves, but we're doing it for our own survival needs, for our own need to be loved and have those connections. When we use those traits to dominate, exploit, oppress, manipulate, silence, exclude or harm others in order to reclaim or restore, maintain a sense of control over life's uncertainties, or to restore a sense of comfort while after being uncomfortable. So it's about creating this sense of certainty. I'm in control. I control everything. I know how the world operates. I know how I need to operate in it to get my needs met. And if any of you get in my way, well, I'm going to try to control you so that I can continue to meet my needs my way. And so there's a number of ways that people go about it, but ultimately it's about our inherent need to be in control. And we control our experience by controlling others. That's, I guess, the non-technical general way of looking at it, or that I like to look at it.
Yeah, so it seems as if there's a certain degree of selfishness, entitlement, grandiosity that tends to come along with narcissistic people. And also, I think most of the times what happens with narcissism is that people often confuse it with narcissistic personality disorder. And so I think the way to like distinguish both of them, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that narcissism is basically full of traits, and whereas NPD is more like behavior patterns. And so that's why one gets a diagnosis. Am I correct?
I think that's a fair way of looking at it. I mean, with NPD is a very specific set of criteria of how those patterns appear. So there could be the, grandiose style as well as the covert style. So the way those behavioral traits will look different, but ultimately it's about this person's need to be in control all the time. And part of narcissism is the way we control is protecting our constructed view of reality, our narrative, our identity. So people who are characterized as, NPD, very, strict self-view of their ability, this almost entitlement to having a certain way of seeing themselves, and that others must see them that way. And if they don't, then they're threatened, and they work hard to restore that view, or coerce people to see them in that certain way. And doesn't make any sense, but that's it. So the identity or the ego is so fragile that this is the only way they know how to maintain this level of comfort or ease or sense of safety and stability, which is not really true stability, because it hinges on this, false identity. And I'm not saying to someone your identity is false, but it's an identity that doesn't incorporate all their attributes. It's their idealized attributes.
Yeah, that's good enough, the distinction. And also, I feel like when we talk about narcissism and narcissistic traits, do you think that anyone who has these narcissistic traits would seek some sort of therapy by any chance? Because they have, these grandiosity, high self-esteem, they think that they're the best, and, do you think they would ever go to therapy and try to work through that or not?
Yeah. That's a great question. I mean, I don't work with, in the clinical space, but from what I've read and I've heard from other clinicians, I think it depends on the situation that person is in. There must be an incentive for them to seek help. So there might be a relationship that's at stake. There might be a job or a livelihood or something economic, something that represents to them really necessary for their survival needs. And I think only then would someone feel like they can go to therapy to get help. But I often hear that people with NPD who go into therapy, or they've suspected NPD but may not have had a diagnosis because they haven't been assessed, they go through this kind of performative therapy, And sometimes they find a way to triangulate with their therapist, and the therapist is groomed to believe that this person is changing, but it's just part of the process. And so there isn't actual change that is stable, and long-term, it's a performative kind of approach, because a lot of people with NPD and also without NPD have gotten really good at working out the rules of how, we need to operate in society or in this world in order to succeed and get ahead. And those are the tactics or strategies they employ in order to do just that. So people who can be easily duped if they don't know of the grooming strategies. So the long answer is, I don't think everyone who should be assessed is assessed, and to get somebody to go to therapy has to be motivated often by external circumstances. Like I said, something high stake, and there's something that can be lost as a result of them not going. So they feel threatened enough to have to do that. Or there could be people who believe that they do need help because there's something about what's happening in their life that they're not happy with. And then they get that diagnosis, and then they seek therapy. So, yeah, long answer.
No, it was very precise. Also, like before, you were talking about grandiose narcissism and covert narcissism. So can you maybe define it, and also, what is the difference between both of them?
So when we talk about grandiose narcissism, that's the typical narcissism that people are familiar with. Very charming, charismatic, win people over easily, happy to be in the spotlight, often very intelligent or great storytellers, easily get the center of attention, and people love being around them because they give off a lot of energy. So it's the most popular and obvious type of narcissistic personality. Whereas the vulnerable or the covert type of narcissism tends to be associated with people who appear more sensitive. They might see themselves as empaths or label themselves as empaths to others' emotional states. So I see it as more as a survival adaptation to having been around emotionally dysregulated parents and or highly anxious parents, and in order to anticipate a parent's emotional needs. So a child grows up in an environment like that. In order for them to keep themselves safe, they work out what is needed of them by anticipating the parent's emotional state. So empathic ability, I think all children have that. I think some enhance it because of the environments they grow up in, and the needs that they're going to need to meet for their parents, to be more of a parent to their parent than the typical parent-child dynamic. So with covert narcissism, I'm more fascinated with this form or these traits because they're not as obvious. But there's so many people that I've encountered in my life that fall into these categories. As much as I don't like to put anyone in a category, there are these traits, and I've had these traits as well, or I have these traits. So we tend to be, so people with covert narcissistic traits tend to be more passive or use their victimhood to demand attention of those who perceive them as fragile or harmless, while that other person sees themselves as the stronger one and capable of fixing or rescuing them. So your heart goes out to that person who might be a great storyteller about their victimhood and all the things that have happened to them. And you're just like, oh, you poor thing. I feel sorry for you. Let me give you some of my love or some of the abundance that I have. Or let me help you heal from this thing. I might have the solution for you. You just easily want to, they tap into that part of you that wants to help and heal. So they might also be highly intuitive, like I mentioned, and share things with you that make you feel special or important, that they've disclosed this sacred bit of information with you. And that's a type of grooming. So you end up forming a bond with them. And they could appear vulnerable or self-deprecating, like I said, so you want to jump in and fix their problems. And an obvious feature is that once you are in this bonded relationship with them, they will always ensure that their suffering is worse than any of your bad days. So if you're having a day where you want them to be there for you, oh no, it won't happen. there's always something worse going on for them, and how dare you center your needs when something, someone else has greater needs than you, or they have greater needs than you. And so I've seen this type of these narcissistic traits often in spiritual healers and therapists. So it can also overlap into what's known as the altruistic narcissism. So people who want to use their skills as healers or therapists or intuitives to help other people, but what they're doing is like often gaslighting with their narratives. And I know more because I'm so intuitive or psychic, and I've had this spiritual experience. So this makes me more in the know than you are, and I know best, and let me help you. And it's a way of controlling other people's experiences. So that's the distinction between the grandiose and the covert or vulnerable style of narcissism. And there are others.
Yeah, there's of course others. So I've been of course, researching narcissism a lot because of experiences that I've had with narcissistic people. So you talked about classical, grandiose, narcissistic. So it seems like they have egotistical, inclinations. They're arrogant, and as you said, they're attention seeking, and they also seek validation from everyone around them. And I think it also kind of aligns with kind of malignant narcissism. This is something that I read somewhere, some research paper. And I think with a malignant narcissism, people tend to be really mean, and they're prone to doing a lot of bad things. So they cheat, they steal, they're liars, criminals, almost psychopathic. And for some reason, the classical grandiose narcissism and malignant narcissism are somewhat similar, if not completely different. And when you talked about covert narcissism, it's almost like they think that the world is coming after them. And so they have this kind of passive aggressive attitude, and that's why they tend to victimize themselves. And so maybe, as you said, it's hard to understand if it's covert narcissism in this case. Another, I think, do you have any other traits that you would want to discuss? And then I'll add two more that I've discussed.
Yeah. Not really traits. I like to look at what is fueling these behaviors, because these behaviors can be fueled by jealousy or envy. They're often fueled by shame. I mean, that's underlying everything, a sense of inferiority and a way to act in order to feel superior in that situation, superior over someone else, or superior over their circumstances. So, but the emotion that fascinates me the most is vengeance. Because that's where harm really happens, when we feel this righteousness to be able to seek out justice because somebody wronged me, and therefore I'm going to do these things necessary, believing that what I'm doing is justice, but it's fueled by vengeance. It's not fueled by some other kind of emotional state like peace or tranquility or calm. It's, I'm going to, restore the balance of power, or whatever it is that's going on in my mind, through the use of vengeance. And that's usually associated with the dark triad of narcissistic personality, like psychopath, Machiavellian, and what's the other one? Narcissist. I don't know. But so those are all malignant. But like what you said, with covert narcissism, there's malignancy in that as well. It just depends how it's used, and I think it's associated with what emotion is fueling the actions.
Yeah, that's very, very true in terms of vengeance, as you said. So I guess one of the other traits that I encountered while researching was communal narcissism. So, how these people who are on Instagram or Facebook and on all of these places, they're like, oh my God, I did this charity, and I'm so great, I'm donating so much money to everyone. And so they tend to have that kind of entitlement, but they kind of want to make sure that everyone knows, exactly, what they're doing. And I think it's because of, this recognition aspect. So a narcissistic person who wants recognition based on all of these charity activities that they're showing to the world. I mean, I guess the true way to do charity is just doing it and not telling anyone. But they are, on the other hand, the opposite of the same thing. And also, I think there was another trait, and I think it was called stealth narcissism, which is basically, you when you feel bad for someone, I think it revolves around relationships. So, if let's say I'm in a relationship with someone, and the relationship is not going well at this point, but I'm still staying with them for the sake of it. So, it's mostly like, okay, I'm gonna stay with this person just because I have to stick it out. And they do that to, their partner. So I think that's more or less the stealth narcissism. Okay, on a different note, so another question I would ask you, like, in terms of statistics or just like your general experience, do you think men are more prone to being narcissistic or like women?
Wow. Well, again, so if we were to look at the research evidence around it, we'd have to ask ourselves, what are the beliefs that have formed these hypotheses about narcissism that we would be looking at different genders? Because, like I said, the covert narcissism is way more subtle. And I've seen this in men and women. It's, genderless, or any gender can, exhibit these traits at toxic or, pathological levels. And so you tend to hear about it more as like the psychopathic boss is male. So the grandiose malignant style is male, and you have other types as female, and not so much about other genders, but it's because it's a spectrum. It's going to show up in different ways in different genders and different contexts. And so I don't know if any statistic will be accurate at this point, unless people know what to look for and to see that pattern consistently, rather than only the kind of typical grandiose narcissistic leader, who often is a man.
Yeah, I think one can definitely find some sort of statistical research on PubMed, maybe. Like, I'll probably look through it after this podcast, because it's generally very interesting to see, what is the gender dynamic here.
Yeah.
So,
and also the context. Sorry, I'm interrupting. It's also looking at the context. Yeah. So if you think about workplace context, so if you think about medical culture or corporate culture, then you look at the breakdown of who are the leaders, who are the top executives, what are the breakdown of gender? Often it's, men. And so in order for a woman to succeed in those environments that are often male dominated, well, they're going to need to employ certain tactics that are possibly more masculine, or more seen as those traits that exude confidence and competence and, rational thinking and non-emotion. So you have to think about what does it ask of a woman to be able to succeed in an environment like that? Well, that would have to be narcissistic to kind of compete with all these people. And if you're a woman of color, you think about how much people have to be super fabulous in order to get there, and what tactics they might have needed to employ in order to gain favor with people in decision-making power to get them to help with their promotion. So I think it's not necessarily fair to be going, man, this, percentage of men who are narcissistic versus women, because we have to always consider what is the context doing, because it's the toxicity of a context that is going to exacerbate any of these traits that might be present in everyone there. If an environment isn't psychologically safe, in order to survive in it and get ahead, you will have to employ different tactics. And I am speaking from experience. So yeah. So we have to think about context and the role of the context versus the role of the person. And can we actually really divide that? Can we just separate it and look at them through separate lenses, and then consider, is the environment making people more narcissistic? And I would say, yeah.
Yeah, I think if it's a case of, men being more narcissistic, it could probably be because of the social aspect of, hyper masculinity, and, that men should not have, all of these emotional reactions. And maybe if they grew up like that in childhood, they could become narcissistic to a certain extent. So that factor also, might have something to do with men maybe being more narcissistic than women.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing is that, or question is that, what kind of, mental health effects do narcissistic people tend to have, if any?
Are you asking about mental health effects on others or mental health comorbidities with people who have, highly expressed narcissistic traits?
The latter, yes.
Again, it's hard for me to say because the minority of a population are being diagnosed, not a majority. And from what I've read and come to understand, there are comorbidities with, someone with narcissistic personality disorder might have other medical diagnoses going on. It's, yeah, I think once people are down a pathway, then they get, you start doing a bunch of assessments to work out, how did I get like this? And how can I change it? How can I improve? But if we look at the general population who are undiagnosed, or, you're questioning, maybe they should go get assessed, you often find that there's features of, the different personality disorders. And, I can't stand the word personality disorder, someone having a disordered personality, rather than looking at a person through a lens of their developmental evolution and what it asked of that child, how they were parented, what level of security they had growing up, and the behavioral adaptations that they developed in order to survive in those circumstances that they've never moved away from after they've left the circumstance, that they've kept them in place because that's what they've needed, and they haven't realized or been made aware that these are the things that they're doing in order to relate with others or form relationships or, advance in their careers. And it may not be necessary to do it in those ways anymore. So yeah, that's why I'm not a big fan of the word disordered personality. That's just me.
No, I understand you to a very deeper level, because I also study psychoanalysis, and I think diving deep into why a person is the way they are would also entail, why they have certain traits that they have. So, when it comes to like mental effects, I think, narcissism can also be acquired if, if the childhood has been very traumatic to a certain extent, or, just by environment. So if a child has always been let down by, their parents, maybe they want to grow up and feel like entitlement, sense of entitlement. So maybe that's, that's what's happening with mental effects. And also, you commented on comorbidities with NPD. I think when we talk about the diagnostical, diagnostical NPD and traits, I think with narcissism, I think it would be okay to say that some people have narcissistic traits with antisocial personality disorder, and some people who are, if anyone's diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, they definitely have narcissistic traits. So again, comorbidities when it comes to, personality disorders.
Right.
And yeah, so what do you think about that, like comorbidities in general?
Again, if we're looking through a medical model lens, and that's the language we would use. If we're looking at a developmental lens that is, humanistic, holistic, then we might have other words to describe it and call them, again, behavioral adaptations or survival adaptations, and looking at the pattern of behavior and the way a person responds to challenges in life that lets their skill set in managing their own emotional state. Because people who've experienced trauma, all of us who've experienced trauma, we become emotionally dysregulated, and we start to experience what's known as empathic disconnection. So we lose trust in others, we lose trust in ourselves, we lose trust in the world around us. And as a result, we're a little bit more suspicious. And because the world that we knew before the trauma had a certain set of parameters parameters, and we had a sense of how we needed to behave or operate in order to meet our needs in that world. Well, that world is gone once we've experienced trauma because the rules no longer apply. So we have to go through this transition process of recreating our identity, and this kind of new rule book of what the world looks like now. And part of it is I don't trust as much because I was betrayed. So I'm a little bit more disconnected. I need to go through a process to repair that breach of trust. And that can only happen through therapeutic process or having relationships with people that help me regain that sense of trust, because they're safe and they're mirroring with me what it is to be in a trusting relationship. And I start to feel more at ease again. And then I change my perspective of the world and my identity. But if we think about humans and how we develop, and we grow up in our environments, then we go through school while we're in those environments, and we eventually leave those environments, but we've never, unless we've started some sort of therapeutic pathway because we've had other things come up, we're not going to question the way we see the world. It's only once we experience certain challenges that we might start questioning things. And that's what might lead on a path to start to, remove those layers of the filters that we built in order to make sense of our world and know how to operate in it and keep ourselves safe. So all the betrayals we've had in our life, and anything can be a trauma to anyone. No doctor can say this is a trauma for you and that's not a trauma for you. It's us who decides, and it's how our nervous system reacts to certain triggers. So that tells us I'm emotionally dysregulated when I see these images, or I hear these words, or something that this trigger is telling me about what happened in my past that led me to create a narrative even before I was verbal about how I see myself with authorities, and how authorities are supposed to be there to keep me safe, and how I don't trust them because of those betrayals. So I hope I've been able to illustrate a story of some of the things that we go through before we have cognition, before we can articulate our way of making sense of the world. We've already created, and we've been born into pre-constructed realities based on our parents' experiences and their traumas and their unresolved traumas, and then going back through the generations. So there's a lot of delayering we need to do. So people who have grown up in these adverse environments where there's been emotional neglect or physical abuse or all sorts of or poverty or, adversities, people will have everyone will have their own unique way of surviving, keeping themselves alive. And that would mean they engage in certain behaviors that are opportunistic and maybe entitled and maybe exploitative in order to do that. And it just means at a certain point in time, people in their lives won't appreciate those ways that they're employing, because they're not children anymore who need to survive because they've, can't trust their parent figures. They're adults now, but have not developed the maturity. They haven't undergone the maturation process in order to be able to relate in a way that means that they trust and others can trust them. That's the work that needs to happen in their life once they hit that tipping point. And there it is.
Yeah, so it's interesting because if someone goes through a traumatic childhood, of course they would have low sense of self-esteem. And so in order to cope up with that low sense of self-esteem, they would want to gather it from their environment. So hence kind of acquiring narcissistic traits just for validation and attention seeking. And that's how they become they boast about their traits, and then also I think the classical narcissism grandiosity then comes into place. Another interesting question would be what kind of partners in terms of relationship do narcissists tend to choose?
Well, all of us, everyone. I mean, like I said, this is in all of us, but if we think about, say, the very strongly expressing covert narcissistic traits, they will find someone, the covert and grandiose narcissism is just same coin, two different sides. So you hear often about the narcissist and the empath, but what it is a codependence, because both people are needing something from each other. This is why they've kind of gravitate toward each other because they each represent an ideal that they're both looking for because they haven't been able to access that inside themselves. And that's the reality. People are always looking for an external source of supply, an emotional supply, a financial supply, an energy supply, whatever it is that they value in order to meet that need that they can't do for themselves. So someone who expresses themselves as quite vulnerable and, center their victimhood will then naturally find somebody who's, a caretaker and a caregiver who will play that role for them. And as soon as that caregiver actually needs that other person to be there for them, during the early phases, the honeymoon phase, everyone's there for each other. It's so great. Whether it's an intimate relationship or a friendship or any sort of relationship, the early stages, we're great. We are seeing each other in our ideal. We're fabulous. We're our best selves. Awesome. We form the bond. And then the old patterns, the defaults start to reveal themselves. By then, we've already been groomed. So it's hard for us to acknowledge that I'm seeing these aspects in this person that I didn't notice at the very beginning. I'll just dismiss it because they have these great qualities. But if you do that enough times, you won't be able to convince yourself that those other qualities, those flaws, don't exist. And so it's working out, how do I accept this person instead of trying to suppress those flaws and control them so that they only reveal their idealized self. And that's what most of the relationship will be happening in that relationship. We're trying to bring that ideal self back. And when the flaws are surfacing, the shadow stuff is surfacing for us to deal with. So I can't give a black and white answer of like, someone like this attracts someone like that. We're looking to meet our needs through each other until we recognize we can meet our needs for ourselves, or we could do it interdependently and not make somebody or expect someone to do certain things for us when there's an ability for us to be able to develop skill to do that for ourselves, or at least to be aware and have good communication skills where we can say, wow, I noticed that every time I feel this way, I look to you to provide the supply for me so that I feel comfortable again. I see how that is asking a lot from you and is really not for you to do. Next time that happens, can you please raise my awareness so that I can employ certain tactics? So that requires self-awareness and a whole bunch of skill to be able to communicate our needs in that way. And in narcissistic dynamics, that's not happening. It's not happening at all. Or one person is trying to tell the other, and the other has such a fragile ego that they take it as an offense, and they've experienced this narcissistic injury, and they lash out and blame that person. So the person learns not to do that again. So they go through this relationship without having certain needs met and afraid they're going to piss off that other person who was supposed to express love and care towards them. Yeah.
Yeah, you're of course very right that when it comes to narcissistic people, they can choose literally anyone as their partner. One of the interesting things is what happens when you have a narcissistic person who chooses a partner who's a highly sensitive person. And then another thing being when you have a narcissistic person and they choose someone who has some sort of a dependent personality, or like someone who has covert narcissism, what kind of dynamics could come in play, how crazy, these relationships actually might be. So that's definitely very, very interesting. Like, what do you think about that? Like, if, a narcissistic person starts a relationship with a dependent person, or, when a narcissistic person starts a relationship with a covert narcissistic person?
Well, they're all dependent. This is the thing. The codependence isn't one way, it's both ways. Everyone's needing. So if you think about if we go back to what I was talking about with our early developmental experiences, if we haven't developed the sense of security and an identity or ability to develop a stable identity or an identity where I'm safe in myself, I can rely on myself, and I know how to reach out for supports without draining them. I know how to meet my needs and be present for others with their needs. If we haven't developed that capacity, good boundaries, etc., well, we are going to be left with things that we don't know how to meet for ourselves. So we're going to naturally gravitate towards others to do that for us. So we're going to, not necessarily look for, we will become, we'll gravitate towards what feels familiar. So if I had a parent-child dynamic where the parent always criticized me for the way I was doing things, then I'm going to find what's familiar, those features familiar in a partner or in a friend. And I won't question it, because even though it's not helpful to me, that's what's familiar to me. That's what's comfortable. That's what's known. So I'm going to naturally go for that. But it won't be obvious at first, but it will come out, and that will be the thing that will come back at me, because it's showing me, shit, this is what I went through as a child. And here I am. I found a partner that's just like this parent. And I'm kind of stuck again. I couldn't escape that. It's here again. So now I have an opportunity to acknowledge it and then seek help to try to change this dynamic or exit this dynamic. So I think we're giving ourselves, we're overestimating our ability to choose or exercise, a free will. We gravitate towards what's familiar. I think that's the setup. That's what we're, it's a conditioning. And again, it depends on the skill set of both people to be able to relate, but we're all codependent until we learn how to not be codependent. We learn how to become more interdependent, and it's that, learning to meet those needs, which could be a lifelong work.
That's a really good explanation right there. Really, really good one. So what advice would you give to people who are in a narcissistic relationship and are suffering through it? Like
Yeah,
some
I
sort
think
of
it
therapy,
depends.
like what can they do?
I mean, it comes back to what are the individual dynamic, or the dynamics that are the narcissistic dynamics that are occurring in that relationship. Because if there's physical violence, the advice would be different than if there's, manipulation or financial exploitation, versus, baiting each other. But it's still unsatisfying, and you don't want to be in it anymore. But every time you try to leave, they find a way to, convince you, to hoover you back in and keep you stuck. So each of those circumstances will have very different advice. And again, so the first thing is always considering your physical safety and your existential safety. So if your physical safety is at risk, then there's certain services you would have to reach out to support you to get out, because if this person's threatening violence or violent with you already, there's a good chance you will, it will exacerbate, and it's how you go about it that won't make things worse for you. So this is, I think, the standard for my messaging with anyone who's discovered they're in a relationship. You want to be able to express your agency without things getting worse for you, as long as you can handle it if it does get worse for you. So you might not be able to handle it if it's violent, but you might be able to handle it if it's not violent and it's just, baiting or psychological, and you've worked out the game. And so you can develop some mental, psychological defense system, so their attempts won't phase you anymore. And then you can slowly start to exit, but you stay in it until you can do that. So yeah, it's really, what can you handle and what supports do you have to help you exit? Or if both parties have a level of awareness about their past traumas and how both of you are projecting your traumas on each other, and that's what's contributing to this ongoing conflict, and you're both committed to seeking help and working on it, because there's enough in the relationship that's worth salvaging and working on and preserving, then it's only in those circumstances where those two are committed and doing the work where things can change and transform. And it happens. I've seen it. I've been participant of it. It's great. But a lot of the time, one person is more aware or more awake to what's going on. Because they've been doing the work for other reasons, and in the process of doing the work, they discover, oh shit, I'm in this kind of narcissistic relationship, and oh my goodness, it reminds me now of the relationship I had with my parent, and this, and it's happening here and here. They have that level of awareness. So of course they're going to want their partner to, or whoever, if it's a friend, a close friend, to be involved in this change. But if it's a truly narcissistic dynamic where one person has that awareness, the other person has a different awareness, and they're quite defensive about it. And if they're narcissistic, they're going to blame the other person. They're going to gaslight them and make them feel shame for wanting to change anything. Because if there's any conflict, it's the other person's fault, not the narcissistic person. So yeah, it's complex, but it's dependent on her skill set, level of self-awareness, and capacity to manage the challenges that will come up once you try to create a change or once you try to exit, and the degree of commitment among both parties to do the work to transform the relationship dynamic. Long answers only.
And they're really good long answers. So yeah, also like you talked about like violent scenarios when it comes to dealing with narcissistic relationships. While I was watching one of these videos on YouTube, someone suggested that when the violence thing happens, you should record as evidence if you tend to take any sort of legal action. But then another aspect is that when you try to tell the narcissistic person that, hey, whatever you're doing, it's not good. The next thing that they would do is love bombing, that you touched upon before, is that, just try to draw you in. And then at some point, they would treat you the same way that they did before. So
yeah,
it's hectic for people who are in these kind of relationships and they're trying to get out. I mean, even if they get out, I think the best way for that getting out aspect would be the no contact thing, like just disappearing, just basically disappearing. So that's also a really good way to just get out of these kind of dynamics.
Yeah, I'll add to that if that's okay, because when you're in a relationship, so when we're talking about narcissistic dynamics, there's a dominant person in that relationship. So the dominant person, they're the one who established the culture, the rules of the relationship, and it doesn't happen officially. No one's sitting there with a rule book and going, this is how things are going to go. I mean, maybe there's some people who do that, but it's often not explicit. It's just there because the dominant person are going to impose their will on the other person. This is what makes it narcissistic. They're in control, but the other person won't see it as control until they do, because it's so familiar. So it's once you, who is in the non-dominant position, try to change the rules, well, they're going to get upset. But if you represent something that is a high stake, so if you're someone who has a high social status or lots of money or something that the other person really values, if you threaten to leave or change things, then they will start to behave in a way that they believe is the way you want them to behave, or the things that they say that they think you want to hear, in order to convince you to stay with them. So this cycle goes on, back and forth, until one of the person who had the issue in the first place gets really sick of it. They see the pattern enough times that they're convinced nothing's going to change. Then they're ready to leave. This is why people who are in, more violent situations or these toxic situations, it takes time for them to be convinced to leave, and they may never be convinced to leave. So when you tell someone, why don't you just leave? They're not ready to, or they don't see things the way you do because they kept being gaslit and regroomed. There's still these internalized narratives by that dominant person that makes it hard for that person to see the reality the way that you do, to be convinced enough or motivated enough to leave. Sometimes it's easier to just stay with what is predictable. So even though you know what's going to happen, it will be harmful or hurtful to you, you can predict it. So it might make it easier than going off into the unknown of life beyond this person, life beyond that context or those conditions, because it's unfamiliar, it's unknown, it's more threatening than what is already there. So coming back to this no contact, this is often why people come back together, even if it's not a violent situation, it was just narcissistic, because even though you're physically apart and you're not talking to each other, there's still an emotional bond. So when, emotions flow, and through our emotions, thoughts, we don't just have thoughts in our head. there's collective thoughts. That's why things get trendy. You know, you see a certain fashion, you're like, ugh, at the beginning of the season. And by the end of the season, you're going out and buying it because you've been, you know, internalized these trendy narratives enough to feel like, oh, this is all right. It's become normalized for you, even though your first experience of it was like, oh, that's hideous. Now I must have it in all the colors that it comes in. So in order for you to regain your mental space, your mental agency, you need to sever all communication with that person, all reminders of that person, because every time they think of you, you're going to be thinking of them, or vice versa. And you're going to believe, oh, you miss, you know, the narrative of what that thought has, you know, the emotion that you feel has this narrative associated with it. And you'll be like, oh, I miss them, or, oh, I'm, you know, I feel bad that I've disconnected from them, and oh, maybe I should reach out to them. And then you're roped back in. So that's why people go back and forth of going in and out of relationship again, because they haven't been able to sever all those connections, restore their sense of self, reclaim their mental sovereignty. And then once you're able to regain your mental sovereignty and re-identify yourself outside of that merger or that, you know, relational version of yourself, unless you can do that, it's easy to come back in, because those narratives between you two that are shared are still there. So once you're able to create that space and that distance, come back to yourself, then you could start to see that other person from a very different perspective and go, oh, what did I see in them? Or, oh, I'm just not attracted to them. How was I ever attracted to them? Because you've been ungaslit. You've extracted that stuff and you've reclaimed your sovereignty from that relationship. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, it makes a lot of sense. You know, I feel like, you know, when it comes to gaslighting, you know, the person who's been gaslit tends to embody this cognitive dissonant state. So, you know, to be or not to be, is this person like this or is he not? And that's why they stay. And some people can just have this cognitive dissonance their entire life and just end up being with this person. And you know that, and also, you know, the aspect of love bombing, so that can also confuse a person. You know, he's good sometimes, you know, he can be violent sometimes. It's a crazy dynamic, but they get trapped within that mental state. And so, you know, cognitive dissonance would also, you know, play a good role for people who end up staying in these kind of relationships. So yeah, that's pretty much about relationships. Now let's get into narcissism within the work dynamics. So, you know, at workplace. So what are your general thoughts on that?
Well, unless you're in a workplace environment and you feel like you could be yourself, not in a way like you could say anything you feel like and just, you know, run naked through the workplace. It's not like that, to that level where you don't have to withhold or just show only certain parts of yourself. You can be you enough in that space. Unless you can do that, you're not in a psychologically safe environment, because you're never going to be able to speak your mind or give feedback or, you know, share your ideas in a way that will be kind of accepted or received or acknowledged. Somebody might take it from you. Someone might put you down. Someone might steal it and, you know, claim it as their own and create their own projects and get accolades. When you see that in an environment, then you're like, okay, I can't trust this place. I can't trust people here. I just have to keep my head down and do what I need to do, but think about transitioning out. And, you know, I think people who, are more easily compliant, good at following rules, good at accepting rules, they have maybe an easier time in those kinds of environments, because organizations have their values, policies, and, you know, their reputation to uphold. So you need to be part of that maintenance of that reputation and the way they want to project themselves as a brand or, you know, as an organization to the world. So you become a representative. So you have to make sure that you are conforming according to it. So if there's any conformity, any assimilation, I would suggest that there's already toxicity. And therefore, likelihood of narcissistic traits, because if you have to conform, it means you're going to be downplaying some of your personality traits and enhancing other traits that are seen as valuable and valued in order to succeed and be deemed worthy. And sometimes the way you go about it might be excluding somebody else, might be microaggressive to somebody else, might be racist, might be, in order to satisfy this kind of cultural value set that enables you to succeed in that kind of environment.
Yeah,
Fun
that's
times.
really true. And a really good response. So what I think about narcissism within workplace is that if anyone, any employee is trapped into this narcissistic kind of workplace, it's often the bosses which are narcissistic, in the sense that they do have like this ambitious, charming kind of attitude, and they tend to undermine their employees by screaming at them, making them work a lot more, and also for some unreasonable raising some unreasonable demands in general, and the employee has to keep up with that kind of behavior. And maybe the reason why they keep up is because of this love bombing aspect, which is giving them enough money. So they think that if he's giving me a good amount of money, then whatever, like I'll cope up with this bullshit. And so I think employees tend to stay because of these several reasons. And also there's of course narcissistic coworkers, right? That within a workplace, there might be a lot of politics, a lot of toxicity, a lot of gossip, taking someone else's project and presenting it to the boss saying it's my idea, and that kind of like environment. And it could be it's actually very detrimental to the person's psyche at a very deeper level, because going to work is already a lot of effort, and then you coming back home, you're like, this politics and like all of that stuff. So what do you think about this narcissism within coworkers, and the politics and toxicity, and how someone can maybe get out of that kind of dynamic or save themselves?
Yeah, I think what I tell everyone is just assume that you're entering into an environment that have features of narcissism by everyone. Don't just come in thinking, oh, this is a new environment, it's never going to be as toxic as my last place. No, you just haven't seen it yet because it's new, but just you wait. Because like I said, unless there's psychological safety and it's, you see it, it's consistent, it's modeled, there's toxicity just there. So if this is in your coworker, so yeah, the first thing is to be alert, not to be suspicious, but be alert of toxicity, which would mean that you need to have good boundaries. So you might have been groomed very early on. This is your pay. You're going to get to do all these things. These are the, career progression prospects for you. Awesome. But the hidden kind of curriculum in all of this is we're going to be asking you to pull more hours than the 9 to 5. We're going to be expecting you to perform at a level that outcompetes everyone else, that is also unrealistic. So that's not written. Those are the things that are possible if you don't establish your boundaries very early on. So the way you get groomed by, a coworker who's been there longer than you, who seems to be more in the know, and they're showing you the ropes, they might start delegating certain things to you that are outside of your role, in order for them to clear certain things off their plate. So know your role really well. And then if somebody's saying, yeah, this is what you'll be doing, you need to start questioning things immediately, not because you're suspicious, but you want to make sure this is what what I've been given is what I've been given, and what you're giving me is part of that, or is it something else? So if you find that, if you're like, I need to make sure that what you're giving me is what I'm here to do, should I be speaking to manager about it? So even bringing that up very early on might, if that person is trying to delegate, offload something onto you that is not your responsibility, they'll already learn early on not to mess with you, because you can go to the man, you're going to ask questions, you're going to check in. And you're not doing it in a suspicious way where you start seeing them as a threat because you don't know. You're just going, I need to have boundaries here. I need to know the boundaries of my work before I start taking on other people's stuff. And I just joined in. So that's the most important thing. So you start pushing back and say no, like, are you able to work later today? No, I have these things because I was told these are the parameters, these are the schedule, this is what, was expected. So I can't leave space for that. And they know early on that they can't mess with you. They'll try a number of times. So you just got to be alert to those attempts. And that way, even though there's toxicity, you can still engender some respect from people or from your coworkers, because you are consistent with your boundaries. You give explanation, not justification, but just like calling them out almost, challenging what they're trying to do without, going, I'm on to you, because you don't want to be perceived as a threat. They might just go, no, she can't because she has, arrangements with her family after, or whatever other things. So yeah, those are some of the advice that I give people when they start something new, because you don't know what you're entering into. You're only told what you're told, and you have to work out the rest. And so it's knowing what questions to ask and being already very clear about your values, your goals, and your boundaries overall, and what boundaries can be loosened a little bit as you progress in that environment.
Yeah, that's very, very true. So, I guess one of the other things that could help out people who have narcissistic co-workers is that you should always keep documentation. You should always keep emails. So if, there's some sort of conflict and if you feel threatened by like a co-worker's behavior, you can just go to the HR. And so when you go to the HR, of course, you can't say that, oh, this person is narcissistic. They'll ask you why, and what is your claim. And so in order to prove that, you should be able to hand out the emails and like the documentations, and you should be well prepared when you go into the HR to take some sort of legal action or any kind of action with the HR people.
Yeah. Well, HR is a whole other kettle of fish as well. Depends on who the coworker is. If it's a manager, yeah, they're not necessarily there for you. Again, it depends on the organization and the HR and how much in the know they are of toxic workplace dynamics and their role in trying to mediate some sort of change. But documentation is key right from the beginning. And some coworkers might start texting you outside because you're developing relationships outside of the work environment, like friendships. You still need to be alert to that. Keep certain text. If something feels off in somebody's text, don't just kind of dismiss it. There's something. Trust your intuition, and you'll start to notice certain patterns. And sometimes you might need to, shift those boundaries they have with you outside of work time, because that's how some people try to isolate you. They befriend you and they become, you spend time outside of work, and then they start to infiltrate your friend group, your family group, and then it becomes hard to extract yourself when they're in your work life and in your personal life. So that's always a risk around workplace relations that go outside the professional environment. And so, like you said, documenting or someone, if there's an email you're getting from one coworker and it seems disrespectful or demanding or entitled or any of those features, then it's kind of like, why are they talking to me like this? Should I get my manager to have a look at this? And then depending on what arrangements you have with your manager, you might need to keep other people CC'd. So there's always witness. And when there's witnesses, the person will be on better behavior. So that's a way to kind of manage or control what comes into your inbox from other people, especially if they know that email is going to be flipped to somebody else to look at. So yeah, it's how not to create a situation or end up in a situation where you're isolated with another coworker. And especially if that coworker is demonstrating some narcissistic traits, not necessarily with you, but with someone else. And if they're doing it with someone else, there's no reason why they won't do it to you at some point. So be alert.
Yeah, very true. You were also very right about intuition. Like, intuition is such a strong thing. Like, if you intuitively feel like someone has narcissistic traits, it probably do, because intuition is probably it's very strong. It's most of the times it's right. So yeah, I think we covered a plethora of topics. And okay, so do you have any final thoughts or comments around narcissism?
Well, these traits are in all of us. I mean, who doesn't want to be in control? Who doesn't like the feeling of being powerful or being in the spotlight? I mean, some people cringe from that, but some people really love it, especially if they feel invisible a lot of the time. And once you get a taste of that, you want more of it. It's quite seductive. And so it helps all of us to have a group of people in our life who help us remind ourselves of our worth and value, that doesn't need external validation, that doesn't need supplies from outside, that it's within us, and it's, really valuing that small, maybe, few people in your life who really help keep you centered and grounded. And I can guarantee everyone has at least one person like that in their life. And we could all have, an amount to help us stay stable and connected.
Yeah, no, those are really, really good advice. So it was amazing talking to you. I always love talking to you every time, be it Clubhouse, be it Wisdom, anywhere. It's always a pleasure. Like, I learned so much, and I feel like you're a really good guy. You're a really good guy, honestly. Like, whenever I talk to you, I feel like I get, some sort of a faith that things, if I'm dealing with narcissistic people or like just people in general, that I can get out of it, and you tend to give good advice on that. So maybe you can quickly tell people where they can find you, social media, or in Australia, whether they want to visit you or something.
Oh, thanks, Sanjana. I love speaking with you because you have an amazing way of synthesizing information, and you're like an encyclopedia across so many disciplines. It just blows my mind how you're able to just kind of, go through the recesses of your mind and like draw out all these nuggets. So thank you. So where I can be found? Well, I publish a piece a week on Substack. So just look up Hacking Narcissism on Substack, just Google it, and you'll find me. I'm also on Twitter at Nats for Docs. I spend a lot of time speaking and running training and public speaking in medical community. And I'm also found on Instagram under the Narcissism Hacker. I'm on Clubhouse as Dr. Nats, speaking about narcissism, among lots of other things, ways to preserve our humanity and hacking narcissism. So I speak a lot about the importance of empathy as a foundational skill and quality to keep us connected to our humanity and to restore our lost humanity from all the things that have happened to us in our life. And I think that's everywhere. And you could Google me. I have podcasts and things. I have my website has a whole bunch of resources, things that I've done in the past. If you want to know more about me and how to get in touch for coaching, consulting work as well. So that's, I think, everything. Yeah.
Yeah, I would highly suggest people to follow you literally everywhere, because you tend to put out a really good amount of knowledge out there, and it's always a pleasure to read through them. It's like intellectual stimulation every time, specifically for me. So yeah, everyone, please go ahead and follow Dr. Nathalie. She's amazing, she's beautiful, and she's amazing, and she's very wise, and she's honestly a sweetheart. And so yeah, on that note, thank you for coming on the podcast. I had such an immense pleasure having you on here and discussing narcissism and just a plethora of topics. I hope you take good care of yourself, and I hope to see you, soon enough on Clubhouse or something.
We'll hear each other there very soon.